Have you ever wondered what happens when the most elite fighting force in American military history walks into a trap designed specifically to destroy them? Perhaps you've heard about Vietnam, about the jungles and the guerrilla warfare, but few truly understand the story of A Shau Valley, a place so deadly that even hardened veterans called it the Valley of Death. Today, I'm going to share with you the harrowing account of how the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese Army meticulously prepared an ambush for the legendary 101st Airborne Division, the Screaming Eagles, only to discover that taunting America's most battle-tested warriors would transform their carefully planned killing ground into their own nightmare. This is a story of courage under impossible odds, of young men who refused to break even when surrounded by an enemy that outnumbered them 10-1, and of a battle that would forever change the nature of warfare in the Vietnamese highlands. Prepare yourself for a journey into one of the most brutal and least understood campaigns of the entire Vietnam War, where the jungle itself became an enemy and survival meant rewriting every rule in the military playbook. If you're here, we share something extraordinary, a profound respect for the men who fought in conflicts that tested the very limits of human endurance. Finding content that authentically explores the tactical complexity, the strategic implications, and above all, the human cost of Vietnam isn't easy. This channel exists precisely for that purpose. Each video represents countless hours diving into declassified after-action reports, interviewing veterans while their memories remain sharp, and piecing together the truth behind the propaganda from both sides. We create history with honesty and deep respect for those who bled in places most Americans couldn't find on a map. Subscribe now and become part of our community of truth seekers. Together, we'll ensure that the sacrifices made in forgotten valleys and nameless hills are never reduced to footnotes. We'll honor these warriors by telling their stories completely, without politics, without judgment, just the raw truth of what they endured. Now, let's return to the spring of 1969, to a valley that would consume thousands of lives.
May 10, 1969, 05:47 hours, Firebase Airborne, A Shau Valley, Thua Thien Province, South Vietnam. Specialist 4th Class Robert Bobby Harkins, just 19 years old from Shreveport, Louisiana, felt the morning mist clinging to his jungle fatigues like a second skin as he peered through the triple canopy jungle that surrounded his position on all sides. The firebase, really nothing more than a hastily bulldozed clearing on a hilltop, barely large enough for 6 105mm howitzers and their crews, had been carved out of the jungle only 72 hours earlier. Bobby's hands trembled slightly as he gripped his M16A1 rifle, not from fear exactly, though God knows there was plenty of that, but from the oppressive awareness that something was fundamentally wrong with the silence that had settled over the valley floor 300 meters below. His unit, Bravo Company, 3rd Battalion, 187th Infantry Regiment, part of the storied 101st Airborne Division, had been warned repeatedly during their brief stateside training that A Shau Valley was different from anywhere else in Vietnam. What they hadn't been told, what they couldn't truly comprehend until they experienced it themselves, was that A Shau wasn't just another valley, but a carefully prepared killing zone where the North Vietnamese Army had spent 4 years turning every tree, every trail, every ridgeline into part of an integrated defensive system designed to bleed American units white. As the first fingers of dawn began to penetrate the canopy, Bobby noticed something that made his blood run cold. The birds had stopped singing. In the jungle, silence meant death was close. Within minutes, The stillness was shattered by the distinctive sound of incoming 82mm mortar rounds, that terrifying whistle that every infantryman learned to recognize in his nightmares. The Viet Cong and North Vietnamese Army regulars had been watching, waiting, and now they were ready to teach the Screaming Eagles that this valley belonged to them. The A Shau Valley, a narrow corridor running roughly north to south for approximately 45 kilometers along the Laotian border in the northernmost provinces of South Vietnam, had by 1969 become something far more significant than its geographical features might suggest. This wasn't just terrain, it was a strategic artery of existential importance to North Vietnam's war effort. The valley served as the western terminus of the Ho Chi Minh Trail, that legendary supply route that snaked down from North Vietnam through the mountains of Laos and into the highlands of South Vietnam. Through A Shau flowed the lifeblood of the communist war machine: ammunition, weapons, rice, medical supplies, and most critically, fresh troops from the north. The valley's steep ridgelines, rising in places to over 1,500 meters, created a natural fortress that the North Vietnamese had fortified with a sophistication that stunned American intelligence analysts when they finally grasped its scope. The NVA had constructed underground storage facilities capable of housing thousands of tons of supplies, had positioned anti-aircraft batteries at calculated intervals to create overlapping fields of fire, and had pre-registered every potential landing zone and firebase location with their mortars and artillery. They had turned the valley into a laboratory for studying American tactics, particularly the helicopter assault operations and fire-based defense strategies that defined the American way of war in Vietnam. When U.S. Special Forces Camp A Shau fell to a massive NVA assault in March 1966, it signaled that the North Vietnamese were no longer content to simply use the valley for logistics. They intended to hold it, to defend it, and to make any American attempt to retake it so costly in blood that the effort would be abandoned. For 3 years after that initial loss, A Shau Valley remained effectively under communist control, a festering wound in the American strategic position that allowed the NVA to launch attacks throughout Viet Cong with virtual impunity. The 101st Airborne Division's deployment to the valley in early 1969 represented a fundamental shift in American strategy. No longer would the valley be ceded to the enemy, but the NVA had prepared for this moment, had trained for it, had fortified positions and laid traps, and they were confident that the Americans, for all their firepower and mobility, could not sustain the casualties necessary to hold the valley. They were about to taunt the Screaming Eagles in ways that would provoke a response of unprecedented ferocity. The men of the 101st Airborne who arrived in A Shau Valley in the spring of 1969 carried with them a legacy that stretched back to the darkest days of World War II. The Screaming Eagles had parachuted into Normandy on D-Day, had held the critical town of Bastogne during the Battle of the Bulge when surrounded by German forces, had fought through Holland during Operation Market Garden. They were a division that defined itself through its refusal to retreat, through its absolute conviction that surrounded simply meant you could attack in any direction. But Vietnam was proving to be a different kind of war, one where traditional measures of success, territory taken, enemy casualties inflicted, meant far less than the political will to continue fighting. The men arriving at A Shau were mostly draftees, young men between 18 and 22 years old, who 6 months earlier had been working in factories, attending college, planning futures that didn't include humping 70-pound rucksacks through triple canopy jungle while dodging bullets from an enemy you rarely saw. They were led by a mix of West Point graduates, ROTC lieutenants fresh from officer candidate school, and NCOs who were either Korean War veterans or were on their second or third tours in Vietnam. This combination of inexperienced enlisted men and hardened leaders created a unit dynamic unique to this period of the war. The veterans knew what was coming, could read the signs, understood the enemy's capabilities. The new troops, the Cherries as they were called, still retained some of that stateside confidence, that belief in American military superiority that would be tested in the most brutal ways imaginable. First Lieutenant James Thompson, a 23-year-old platoon leader from Atlanta, Georgia, who had graduated from West Point just 18 months earlier, would later describe the moment his Huey helicopter descended into the valley as the moment his education truly began. Nothing at the academy, no training exercise at Fort Benning, no tactical problem discussed in sterile classrooms had prepared him for the reality of combat in terrain that favored the defender so completely. The NVA could hear the helicopters coming from kilometers away, could pre-position their forces, could choose the moment of engagement. The Americans arrived loud, obvious, their insertion points constrained by the limited landing zones in the dense jungle. Every landing was a potential ambush. Every patrol was a calculated risk. And the NVA knew it, exploited it, and used it to inflict a steady drumbeat of casualties designed not to win decisive battles, but to erode American will one casualty at a time. The operation that would become known as Operation Apache Snow began on May 10, 1969, with the 101st Airborne Division conducting a multi-battalion air assault into the northern A Shau Valley. The operational plan, conceived at division headquarters in Camp Eagle near Huey City, called for the systematic clearing of the valley floor and ridge lines, the interdiction of enemy supply routes, and the destruction of the extensive bunker complexes that intelligence indicated honeycombed the area. On paper, it was a textbook application of airmobile warfare doctrine. Multiple battalions would be inserted simultaneously at different locations, would conduct search and destroy operations, would be supported by massive artillery fire from newly established fire bases, and would be extracted once their mission was complete. The reality, as it always did in Vietnam, diverged dramatically from the plan within hours of execution. The NVA, rather than scattering before the American onslaught as they had in other areas, chose to stand and fight. They had prepared the battlefield meticulously, had constructed bunker complexes so well camouflaged that American troops walked within meters of them without detecting them, had positioned their forces to attack the Americans at their most vulnerable moments during insertion and resupply. The first indication that this operation would be different came when Alpha Company, 3rd Battalion, 187th Infantry, touched down at Landing Zone Stallion on the valley floor. Before half the company had exited their helicopters, they came under intense automatic weapons fire from positions so close that helicopter door gunners couldn't engage without risking hitting their own troops. 3 helicopters were damaged, 1 crashed, and within 15 minutes, Alpha Company had taken 11 casualties and was pinned down in elephant grass that provided concealment but no protection from the AK-47 rounds snapping through it. The company commander, Captain Michael Brady, a 31-year-old career officer on his 2nd Vietnam tour, immediately recognized that they had landed directly in a prepared kill zone. The textbook response would be to call for artillery fire and extract under its cover. But the battalion commander, monitoring the situation from his command helicopter orbiting at 3,000 feet, ordered Brady to secure the LZ and hold it for follow-on forces. The battle for A Shau Valley had begun, and already the Americans were learning that the enemy had no intention of allowing them to dictate the terms of engagement. Bobby Harkins, still crouched in his fighting position at Firebase Airborne, as the sun climbed higher and the heat became oppressive, listened to the radio chatter describing Alpha Company's predicament. The firebase itself, positioned on a hilltop the map designated as Hill 937, but which would soon earn a far more ominous name, was receiving sporadic sniper fire that kept everyone's heads down, but hadn't yet developed into a full assault. The firebase's defensive perimeter, hastily prepared in the 72 hours since its establishment, consisted of fighting positions dug into the rocky soil, concertina wire strung in irregular patterns, determined more by available materials than tactical considerations, and claymore mines positioned to cover the most likely avenues of approach. The 6 howitzers, 105mm towed artillery pieces that represented the firebase's reason for existence, were positioned in the center of the perimeter and were already firing support missions for the units engaged across the valley. Each howitzer crew worked with mechanical precision, born of endless training, loading, aiming, firing in a rhythm that would continue for hours until the barrels glowed red and the ammunition stockpile dwindled at an alarming rate. Bobby's position was on the northern perimeter, the side that faced the ridgeline, where intelligence suggested the NVA had observation posts. His squad leader, Sergeant David Doc Morrison, a 26-year-old from Detroit on his third tour, who had extended twice because he believed in the mission even as doubts crept into his mind, had instructed them to watch for any movement in the tree line 200 meters away. The NVA, Doc explained in his characteristic matter-of-fact manner, liked to probe defenses, to test reactions, to identify weak points before launching their main assault. They were patient, disciplined, and utterly committed. At 08:47 hours, Bobby saw movement in the tree line, just a shadow really, something that didn't belong. He reported it to Doc, who studied the area through binoculars before keying his radio and reporting a possible enemy position. Within minutes, one of the howitzers adjusted its aim and fired 3 rounds of high explosive directly into the suspected location. The tree line erupted in secondary explosions, confirming that the NVA had been positioning weapons there. But instead of deterring them, the artillery strike seemed to provoke them. Within 10 minutes, Firebase Airborne was receiving incoming fire from 3 different directions: mortar rounds, rocket-propelled grenades, and heavy machine gun fire that turned the morning air into a cacophony of explosions and the distinctive crack of supersonic projectiles passing overhead. The firebase's defenders returned fire, but they were shooting at an enemy they couldn't see, at muzzle flashes in the shadows, at sounds more than targets. This was the nature of warfare in A Shau Valley. A constant exchange of fire with an enemy that melted into the jungle like smoke, that struck and vanished, that made you expend ammunition and energy fighting ghosts while they prepared the real blow. Have you ever caught yourself wondering what goes through a soldier's mind during that first moment when the training becomes real, when the bullets are no longer imaginary but are actually trying to kill you? Or perhaps you know someone who served in Vietnam, a father, an uncle, a neighbor, who came home changed and could never quite explain what they experienced in those green hells half a world away. I know many of you carry connections to this war, stories passed down, questions never answered, gaps in family histories that coincide with tours in Southeast Asia. This is your space to share those stories. Leave in the comments. My connection to the Vietnam War is, and tell us your perspective. Maybe your father served with the 101st. Maybe you found his letters from A Shau Valley and never understood what they meant. Maybe you yourself walked those ridgelines and the memories still wake you at night. Your experience matters. Your story is part of the historical record we're building together. I'm pausing here because I believe history only becomes real when we connect it to the human beings who lived it, who survived it, or who didn't come home. Take a moment, share your story, because someone out there needs to hear it. By the afternoon of May 10th, 3 of the 5 battalions inserted into A Shau Valley were in heavy contact with NVA forces. The North Vietnamese, rather than conducting their typical hit-and-run attacks, were standing their ground, sometimes maneuvering to attack American units from multiple directions simultaneously. This was a significant tactical shift that indicated a level of confidence and preparation that worried the division command staff. At 14:35 hours, Bravo Company, 3rd Battalion, 187th Infantry, Bobby Harkins's unit, received orders to move off Firebase Airborne and conduct a reconnaissance in force down the northern slope of Hill 937 toward a suspected enemy staging area identified through radio intercepts and aerial reconnaissance. The company commander, Captain Richard Littman, a 29-year-old from Ohio who had already been wounded twice in previous tours, gathered his platoon leaders and briefed the mission with a grim expression that conveyed his assessment of their chances. They would move in a column formation, 1st Platoon in the lead, with 100-meter intervals between platoons to prevent a single ambush from catching the entire company. They would have artillery support on call, helicopter gunships overhead if the weather cooperated, and a reaction force standing by at the fire base if they got into trouble. It all sounded reasonable in the briefing, textbook even. But Captain Littman, a veteran of the Central Highlands fighting, knew that doctrine meant little in jungles so thick you couldn't see 10 meters in any direction. They moved out at 15:10 hours, 147 men in single file descending into the green twilight beneath the canopy. The point man, Private First Class Terrence Williams from Chicago, 19 years old and 3 months in country, moved with exaggerated caution, every sense heightened, searching for the telltale signs of enemy presence, disturbed earth indicating buried mines, tripwires stretched across the trail, the smell of cigarette smoke or cooking fires, the complete absence of animal sounds. Behind him, the column stretched back up the slope, each man maintaining visual contact with the man ahead while watching his assigned sector. The jungle pressed in from all sides, oppressive in its density, the air thick with humidity that made every breath feel inadequate. They had covered approximately 300 meters, less than 15 minutes of movement, when Williams spotted something that made him freeze. A carefully camouflaged bunker entrance, barely visible in the vegetation 15 meters ahead. He raised his fist, the signal to halt, and slowly lowered himself to a crouch while using hand signals to communicate what he had seen. The column froze, each man seeking whatever cover the terrain offered. Lieutenant Thompson, leading 1st Platoon, worked his way forward to assess the situation. Through his binoculars, he could see not just one bunker, but indications of an entire complex, a network of fighting positions connected by trenches, all positioned to create overlapping fields of fire across the slope. This wasn't a temporary position. This was a fortified defensive line that had taken weeks or months to construct. He radioed Captain Littman with his findings and requested instructions. The discovery of the bunker complex precipitated a command decision that would shape everything that followed. Captain Littman could have ordered a withdrawal, could have called in artillery and airstrikes to pound the position before attempting to assault it, could have requested additional units to conduct a coordinated attack. Instead, pressure from battalion headquarters to maintain momentum, to keep pushing the NVA, to demonstrate the offensive spirit that supposedly defined the American way of war, led to orders to assault the position immediately. 1st Platoon would conduct a frontal assault, while 2nd Platoon maneuvered to flank the position from the west. 3rd Platoon would remain in reserve. It was an aggressive plan, the kind of direct action approach that American commanders favored, based on the belief that American firepower and fighting spirit would overwhelm the enemy's defensive preparations. What wasn't factored into this plan was the possibility that the bunker complex they had discovered was just the first defensive line in a series of positions that stretched back up the mountain, that the NVA had designed their defense not to hold ground at any particular point, but to channel American attacks into pre-planned killing zones, where concentrated fire could decimate entire platoons in minutes. At 16:25 hours, 1st Platoon began its assault, advancing by fire and movement, one squad providing covering fire, while another bounded forward 10 or 15 meters before going to ground and providing cover for the next squad's movement. The technique was sound, exactly as taught at Fort Benning, but the NVA had faced this tactic hundreds of times before. They held their fire as the Americans advanced, allowing them to close within 50 meters of the bunker line, close enough that artillery support would be danger close, close enough that the Americans were fully committed to the assault. Then the NVA opened fire. The volume of fire that erupted from the bunker complex was stunning in its intensity. AK-47s, RPD light machine guns, RPG-7 rocket-propelled grenades, all fired simultaneously from positions so well concealed that their muzzle flashes were barely visible. 1st Platoon's lead squad was caught in the open, caught mid-bound with no cover, and within seconds, 5 men were down, killed or wounded. The platoon went to ground, trying to return fire, but they were firing at positions they couldn't identify, suppressing an enemy that was protected by logs and earth. Lieutenant Thompson, his training overridden by instinct and the desperate need to help his men, moved forward to organize a withdrawal of the wounded. An RPG detonated 3 meters from his position, the overpressure from the explosion rupturing his eardrums and filling his vision with stars, but somehow leaving him functionally intact. He grabbed the nearest wounded man, Private Williams, who had been hit in both legs, and began dragging him back toward the platoon's hasty defensive position. The firefight continued for 40 minutes, an eternity of controlled chaos where training and instinct battled panic, and the overwhelming desire to simply run. Bravo Company's assault had been stopped cold, had taken 12 casualties, including 3 killed, and had learned the brutal lesson that A Shau Valley would teach again and again: the NVA wasn't running anymore. The battle that developed over the next 10 days would later be called the Battle of Hamburger Hill, a name that perfectly captured its essence: a meat grinder where American units were fed into repeated assaults up a heavily fortified mountain, taking horrific casualties for gains measured in meters. Hill 937, the military designation for the mountain that dominated the northern A Shau Valley, had been transformed by the NVA's 29th Regiment into a fortress of staggering sophistication. Intelligence estimates, later confirmed through prisoner interrogations, indicated that approximately 1,200 to 1,500 NVA soldiers occupied bunker complexes arranged in concentric rings from the base to the summit. These weren't simple fighting holes. These were reinforced structures built with logs up to 12 inches in diameter, covered with 3 feet of earth, connected by communication trenches deep enough to move through while standing, supplied with ammunition caches, medical bunkers, and command posts buried so deeply that even 500-pound bombs rarely destroyed them. The NVA had prepared this position, knowing the Americans would come, had studied American tactics, had identified weaknesses in the airmobile doctrine that emphasized speed and surprise over methodical preparation. They knew that American units relied on helicopter resupply, which meant they couldn't sustain multi-day battles without established landing zones. They knew that American commanders were under pressure to show results quickly, which made them vulnerable to hasty decisions. And they knew that the weather in the A Shau Valley during the monsoon season, which was beginning, could ground helicopters for hours or days, isolating units and negating the Americans' greatest tactical advantage. Over the next week, elements of the 101st Airborne Division would assault Hill 937 repeatedly, would take casualties that appalled even hardened combat veterans, would see entire platoons reduced to half strength in single engagements. The division commander, Major General Melvin Zayas, committed more units to the battle, a decision that remains controversial to this day. Critics argued that the hill had no strategic value, that it could have been bypassed or simply pounded into rubble with B-52 strikes. Supporters contended that allowing the NVA to hold such a dominant position was unacceptable, that American credibility required demonstrating that no enemy position was impregnable. Both arguments had merit. What was undeniable was the cost. Bobby Harkins found himself back at Firebase Airborne during a brief stand-down for his unit after their initial contact. The firebase had been under sporadic attack for 4 straight days, mortar rounds and rockets arriving at irregular intervals calculated to prevent sleep, to wear down the defenders, to create the psychological conditions where mistakes became inevitable. The howitzer crews continued their work mechanically. Some men had fired so many rounds that they had lost partial hearing despite wearing inadequate ear protection. The ammunition supply, trucked in by helicopter under fire, was being expended at a rate that concerned the logistics officers, but which couldn't be reduced, while units across the valley were in contact and screaming for fire support. Bobby had aged a decade in 4 days. The kid from Shreveport who had enlisted with vague ideas about serving his country and maybe earning money for college had disappeared somewhere on that jungle slope, replaced by something harder, more focused, stripped of illusions. He had seen men he knew killed, had heard their screams, had smelled the distinctive copper smell of blood mixed with cordite and jungle rot. He had fired his rifle at shadows, had thrown grenades into bunkers, had experienced the strange disassociation where you're doing these things, but also watching yourself do them from outside your body. During the stand-down, the company received replacements, fresh troops flown in from Camp Eagle, kids so new they still had stateside tans, whose uniforms weren't yet bleached by jungle mold, who looked at the veterans with a mixture of awe and fear. Bobby tried to remember being that naive and couldn't. One of the replacements, a private named Eddie Gorski from Pennsylvania, asked Bobby what it was like, the combat. Bobby stared at him for a long moment, trying to formulate an answer that wouldn't sound insane or wouldn't completely terrify the kid. Finally, he just said, "It's loud, it's confusing. Do what your NCO tells you and don't think too much." It was inadequate, but there were no adequate words. The sergeants integrated the replacements into the squads, tried to pair them with experienced troops who might keep them alive long enough to learn. Doc Morrison, the squad leader, gave them his standard speech. Stay low, conserve your ammunition, don't bunch up, watch where the man in front of you steps, never volunteer for anything, and if you get hit, make noise so we know to come get you. It was practical advice born of 3 tours and dozens of close calls. On May 18th, 8 days into Operation Apache Snow, Bravo Company received orders to assault Hill 937 again, this time as part of a coordinated attack with 2 other battalions hitting different sectors of the mountain. The plan called for massive preparatory fires, B-52 strikes on the summit positions, followed by artillery fire walking up the slope ahead of the attacking infantry. It sounded overwhelming on paper, The reality was that the jungle absorbed explosions, that bunkers survived direct hits, that the NVA simply waited out the bombardment and emerged ready to fight. The assault that began at 6:30 hours on May 18th represented everything brutal and futile about Vietnam in microcosm. American troops advanced uphill through jungle so thick that maintaining unit cohesion was nearly impossible, through vegetation shredded by artillery fire, but which still limited visibility to a few meters, through terrain that became a muddy nightmare as the monsoon rains began in earnest. They advanced toward an enemy that was invisible until it opened fire, that fought from positions that seemed immune to anything short of a direct hit from a 2,000-pound bomb, that demonstrated a tactical sophistication that surprised officers who had been taught to think of Asian armies as inferior. Bravo Company's objective was a section of the ridgeline about 200 meters below the summit, a position intelligence designated as Bunker Complex Bravo. They moved in column, 1st Platoon again in the lead, because that's where Lieutenant Thompson insisted on being, despite his ruptured eardrums and the regulation that probably should have sent him to a medical facility. The slope steepened as they climbed, forcing the troops to grab vegetation to pull themselves forward, making tactical movement impossible, turning the assault into something closer to a climb, where enemy fire could come from any direction. At 07:15 hours, they made contact. The NVA allowed 1st Platoon's lead squad to reach within 30 meters of the bunker line before opening fire. The first burst from an RPD machine gun cut down the point man, then traversed across the squad, hitting 4 more men in 3 seconds. The jungle erupted in fire, automatic weapons from multiple positions, RPGs launched at point-blank range, even hand grenades rolled down the slope toward the Americans. 1st Platoon went to ground, sought whatever defilade the terrain offered, and tried to return fire. But they were attacking uphill against a fortified enemy with clear fields of fire, and the tactical situation was hopeless from the start. Lieutenant Thompson, shouting orders over the cacophony, tried to organize a flanking movement, sending 3rd Squad to the right to attack the bunker line from an angle. 3rd Squad made it 15 meters before running into another bunker complex that hadn't appeared on any map or aerial photograph. They took casualties immediately, were pinned down, and now the entire platoon was engaged across a front of less than 50 meters, with no room to maneuver and no way to disengage without abandoning the wounded. Captain Littman, monitoring the situation from his position 50 meters back with the company command group, faced the same impossible decision that company commanders throughout the valley were facing: continue the assault and take more casualties, or break contact and be accused of lacking offensive spirit. He chose to continue, ordering 2nd Platoon to move up on 1st Platoon's left flank and add their weight to the assault. The battle for that section of ridgeline consumed the entire day. Platoons took turns assaulting, would gain a few meters, would take casualties, would fall back to reorganize while another platoon attempted to exploit their gains. The NVA fought with a determination that bordered on fanaticism, refusing to yield positions even when American forces closed within grenade range, often fighting until they were killed in their bunkers rather than retreating. This wasn't the guerrilla warfare of ambush and withdraw that characterized so much of the Vietnam conflict. This was conventional combat, frontal assaults against prepared defenses, reminiscent of battles from earlier wars. By 1800 hours, as darkness began to fall and the rain intensified, Bravo Company had advanced approximately 100 meters at a cost of 23 casualties, including 7 killed. They established a hasty defensive perimeter on the ground they had gained, knowing that the NVA would likely attempt to infiltrate their lines during the night, would try to recover their dead and wounded, would probe for weaknesses. The troops dug in as best they could in the rocky soil, established guard rotations, tried to tend to the wounded while waiting for medevac helicopters that might not be able to fly in the deteriorating weather. Bobby Harkins, his uniform soaked through, his hands shaking from exhaustion and adrenaline depletion, found himself sharing a fighting position with Eddie Gorski, the replacement who had asked what combat was like. Eddie had been shot through the shoulder during the day's fighting, a through-and-through wound that missed bone and major blood vessels, but hurt like hell. The company medic had patched him up, had given him morphine and antibiotics, but Eddie was staying on the line because there was no way to evacuate him and because every rifle mattered. Eddie kept apologizing to Bobby, kept saying he had screwed up, had exposed himself, had let everyone down. Bobby, too tired to sugarcoat it, told Eddie to shut up and stay awake because apologizing to dead men was pointless, but staying alert might keep them both alive. It was harsh, but it was honest, and in that moment, honesty was all Bobby had left to give. Through the night, they heard movement in the jungle around them, sometimes close enough to hear Vietnamese voices, but the NVA didn't attack. They were consolidating their own positions, bringing up reinforcements, preparing for the next day's fighting. The rain continued, a steady downpour that filled fighting positions with water, made weapons maintenance nearly impossible, turned everything into a miserable existence where comfort was a memory from a previous life. May 19th brought a repeat of May 18th with minor variations in tactics, but the same brutal arithmetic of casualties and minimal gains. The division commander, under pressure from MACV headquarters to demonstrate progress, committed additional units to the battle. Elements of the 1st and 2nd Battalions of the 506th Infantry Regiment, the famous Band of Brothers unit from World War II, joined the assault from different directions, attempting to envelop the NVA positions. The coordination required for such a complex maneuver in dense jungle with limited communications proved nearly impossible. Units sometimes came close to engaging each other. Friendly fire incidents were narrowly avoided, and the fog of war was so complete that company commanders sometimes had only the vaguest idea where their own platoons were positioned. The artillery support, while massive in volume, proved less effective than hoped. The jungle canopy created air bursts that sometimes wounded friendly troops, while direct hits on bunkers often failed to penetrate the overhead cover. Air support, the fighters and helicopter gunships that were supposed to provide the decisive edge, was limited by weather and by the close proximity of friendly and enemy forces. Close air support sorties sometimes dropped their ordnance hundreds of meters from the intended target because pilots couldn't identify ground positions through the canopy. The battle was becoming what Vietnam critics would later cite as the perfect example of a meat grinder, where American technological advantages were neutralized by terrain and enemy tactics, where casualties mounted for objectives that would be abandoned weeks later. But for the men on the ground, these strategic considerations were irrelevant. They fought because they were ordered to fight, because their friends were fighting, because stopping meant abandoning the wounded, and because training and discipline and pride created a momentum that carried them forward even when reason said to stop. Bobby Harkins assaulted the same bunker complex 3 times on May 19th. Each time, he and his squad would move forward under covering fire, would close within 30 or 40 meters of the enemy positions, would take casualties, and would be forced to pull back. Each time he saw men he knew hit, saw them fall, heard their screams. Each time he kept moving, because stopping wasn't an option his mind could process anymore. During one assault, he found himself face to face with an NVA soldier in a trench, close enough to see the man's eyes, young like his own, frightened like his own. They both raised their weapons, but Bobby fired first, A 3-round burst from his M16 that hit the soldier in the chest and spun him around. Bobby didn't stop, didn't check if the man was dead, just kept moving because that's what you did. You kept moving until someone told you to stop. He would remember that soldier's face for the rest of his life, would see it in dreams, would wonder who he had been, whether he had a family, whether he had volunteered or been conscripted. But in the moment, there was no time for reflection, only the overwhelming imperative to survive and help his unit survive. By May 20th, the Battle of Hamburger Hill had become international news, had attracted attention from anti-war activists who seized on it as evidence of the war's futility, had sparked debates in Congress about tactics and objectives, had created a political crisis that would influence how future operations were planned. But in the A Shau Valley, on the slopes of Hill 937, the men of the 101st Airborne Division knew nothing of the political firestorm. They knew only that they had been ordered to take the hill, that the NVA was determined to hold it, and that the battle had become personal in ways that transcended military objectives. They were fighting for the men beside them, for the memory of those who had fallen, for the simple, stubborn refusal to quit that defined the American soldier, even when the mission no longer made sense. On May 20th, the weather cleared briefly, allowing for sustained air support that finally began to make a difference. F-4 Phantom jets dropped napalm on the summit positions, the jellied gasoline incinerating vegetation and creating firestorms that forced the NVA to abandon some positions. Army helicopter gunships, AH-1 Cobras, mounting M134 miniguns and two 75-inch rocket pods, conducted continuous gun runs along the ridgelines, suppressing NVA fire and allowing American troops to advance with slightly less opposition. The artillery fire intensified, with multiple batteries coordinating time-on-target missions that put hundreds of rounds simultaneously on target, overwhelming the NVA's ability to take cover. The cumulative effect of this massive application of firepower finally began to crack the NVA defense. American units reported encountering abandoned bunkers, finding dead NVA soldiers who hadn't been evacuated, capturing documents that indicated declining morale among the defenders. The breakthrough came on the afternoon of May 20th, when elements of the 506th Infantry managed to penetrate the NVA's inner defensive ring and establish positions within 200 meters of the summit. For the first time in 10 days of fighting, American forces could see the top of the hill they had been dying to reach. The final assault on Hill 937 began at 1000 hours on May 20th, 1969, and involved coordinated attacks by 4 infantry companies converging on the summit from different directions. Bravo Company, reduced to barely 100 effectives from its original strength of 147, attacked from the north. They had been fighting almost continuously for 10 days, had taken over 40 casualties, had been resupplied with ammunition and replacements, but were running on nothing but willpower and the finish line that was finally visible. Bobby Harkins, promoted to team leader after his original team leader was killed, led 4 men up the final slope. They moved through a landscape so devastated by bombing and artillery that it resembled photographs of World War I battlefields, trees reduced to shattered stumps, the ground churned into mud, the smell of explosives and death omnipresent. The NVA, their defensive positions finally untenable, their casualties unsustainable, their supply lines cut by the weather and American interdiction, began to withdraw toward Laos. But they didn't run. They conducted a fighting withdrawal, leaving rear guards to slow the American advance, mining paths, booby-trapping abandoned bunkers, extracting every possible cost for every meter yielded. The final resistance collapsed at 12:45 hours when American troops from multiple units converged on the summit and found it abandoned except for dead NVA soldiers and the detritus of battle. They had taken Hill 937. They had won the Battle of Hamburger Hill. The cost was staggering and would spark controversy that echoed for years. The 101st Airborne Division suffered 72 killed and 372 wounded during the 10-day battle. Bravo Company alone lost 9 killed and 36 wounded. The NVA losses were estimated at over 600 killed, though exact numbers were impossible to verify as the Communists evacuated most of their dead. In pure military terms, measured by casualty ratios, the Americans had won decisively, but the strategic value of the victory was immediately questioned when, less than a month later, the 101st Airborne withdrew from Hill 937 and the NVA simply reoccupied it without opposition. The entire bloody battle had been fought for a piece of ground that neither side intended to hold permanently, that had no intrinsic value beyond its tactical position, that represented nothing but a test of wills between two armies locked in a conflict that neither could win decisively. Bobby Harkins stood on the summit of Hill 937 on the afternoon of May 20th, surrounded by the men of Bravo Company who had survived, looking out over the A Shau Valley that stretched below in shades of green, punctuated by the grey-brown scars of bomb craters and artillery impacts. He felt nothing, no sense of victory, no relief, no pride. Just an emptiness where emotions should have been, a numbness that seemed to encompass not just his mind but his entire body. Around him, other men sat or stood with the same 1,000-yard stare, the same emotional disconnection. A few tried to cheer, to celebrate, but the cheers died quickly, felt hollow and false. They had won, but what had they won? A hill they would abandon. Recognition that would come decades too late. The knowledge that they had endured something that would mark them forever. Eddie Gorski, the replacement who had taken a shoulder wound on his first day of combat and had fought for 9 more days, approached Bobby and asked if it was always like this. Bobby understood the question, understood that Eddie was asking not about combat, but about the aftermath, about the emotional void that followed survival. Bobby thought about how to answer, about what truth he could offer. Finally, he said what he believed. "I don't know, man. This was my first real fight too. But I think maybe it's always like this. You survive, and you realize survival isn't the victory you thought it would be." It wasn't profound, but it was honest. And honesty was the only thing that held any value in that moment. The helicopters arrived to begin extracting the survivors, to carry them back to Camp Eagle for hot showers, hot food, and a week of stand down where they would try to process what they had experienced. As Bobby boarded the Huey, he looked back at the hill one last time, at the ground they had paid for in blood, at the bunkers they had taken one by one, at the jungle that had witnessed so much death. He knew he would never forget this place, would carry it with him always, a piece of A Shau Valley embedded in his soul like shrapnel that couldn't be removed. The helicopter lifted off, banking away from the hill, and Bobby watched it recede into the distance. Other units were already moving up to hold the position temporarily, and Bobby knew what the NVA would do once the Americans left. The whole brutal cycle would repeat, different hills, different valleys, the same waste of life and potential. But that was beyond his control, beyond his responsibility. He had done what was asked of him, had fought with courage, had survived when many hadn't. That would have to be enough. The aftermath of Hamburger Hill reverberated through the American military and political establishment with an intensity that surprised everyone involved. When news of the casualties reached the United States, when reporters described the 10-day battle for a hill that was subsequently abandoned, when Senator Edward Kennedy called it senseless and irresponsible, the military's conduct of the war came under scrutiny that accelerated the already growing anti-war movement. The battle became symbolic of everything critics saw as wrong with American strategy in Vietnam, the focus on body counts rather than strategic objectives, the willingness to accept casualties for temporary tactical gains, the disconnect between what was happening on the ground and what was being reported to the American public. For the soldiers who fought at Hamburger Hill, the political controversy was both validating and infuriating. Validating because someone finally acknowledged the insanity of what they had endured. Infuriating because the criticism felt like judgment of them, rather than of the generals and politicians who had ordered the assault. They had done their duty, had fought with extraordinary courage against a determined enemy in conditions that tested the limits of human endurance. They had prevailed through sheer will and sacrifice, and now they were being held up as examples of military futility. It was a betrayal that cut deeply, that contributed to the broader sense among Vietnam veterans that their service was unappreciated, that the nation they had served had turned its back on them. The military learned lessons from Hamburger Hill, though whether they were the right lessons remains debatable. Future operations in the A Shau Valley were conducted differently, with less emphasis on frontal assaults and more on interdiction and harassment. The concept of securing and holding terrain gradually gave way to strategies focused on disrupting enemy logistics and avoiding set-piece battles. But these tactical adjustments couldn't address the fundamental strategic problem. The United States was fighting a war with limited means to achieve unlimited objectives against an enemy that was willing to accept casualties indefinitely. The NVA could afford to lose battles like Hamburger Hill because they were winning the larger war of attrition, bleeding American will rather than American lives, knowing that eventually the United States would tire of the cost and withdraw. In the decades following the Vietnam War, the veterans of Hamburger Hill struggled with their experiences in ways that mirrored the struggles of Vietnam veterans generally. Many developed post-traumatic stress disorder, though in the 1970s and 1980s, before PTSD was widely recognized, their symptoms were often dismissed as weakness or criminality. They had nightmares, flashbacks, periods of dissociation where they were back in the A Shau Valley, fighting for their lives. They struggled with survivor's guilt, questioning why they lived when friends died, replaying moments where different choices might have saved someone. They self-medicated with alcohol and drugs, destroyed relationships, cycled through jobs, and tried to function in a society that seemed utterly alien compared to the intense brotherhood of combat. Bobby Harkins returned to Shreveport in 1970, his one-year tour completed, his body intact, but his mind scarred in ways no physical examination could detect. He tried to resume the life he had left, enrolled in community college using his GI Bill benefits, got a job at a hardware store, married his high school girlfriend. But the civilian world felt unreal, the concerns of daily life trivial compared to what he had experienced. He couldn't explain to anyone what A Shau Valley had been like, couldn't make them understand the fear and the bonding and the moral complexity of fighting in a war where you couldn't distinguish enemies from civilians, where victory was meaningless and survival was everything. He attended a few veterans' meetings, but found them depressing, rooms full of men as damaged as he was, all trying to find meaning in experiences that resisted meaning. Eventually, he stopped talking about the war altogether, let people think he had been a clerk or a mechanic or anything other than an infantryman who had spent 10 days in hell. It was easier that way, required less explanation, provoked fewer uncomfortable questions. But the silence exacted its own cost, created a wall between him and everyone else, a secret history that defined him, but which he could never share. In the 1980s, as the country began to reckon more honestly with Vietnam, as the Vietnam Veterans Memorial was dedicated and public attitudes shifted from hostility to sympathy, Bobby began attending reunions of Bravo Company veterans. These gatherings, held annually in different cities, became the only places where he could truly be himself, where he could talk about what happened without judgment or incomprehension. The men who had been there understood in ways no one else could. They laughed together about absurd moments, cried together about those who didn't make it home, and found in each other's company a validation that the civilian world couldn't provide. They weren't looking for glory or recognition. They just wanted acknowledgement that their service had mattered, that their sacrifices had been for something more than political miscalculation. The A Shau Valley remains today a remote region of Vietnam, largely returned to jungle, the scars of war slowly being reclaimed by nature. The bunkers on Hill 937 have collapsed, the trenches have filled with vegetation, the trees have grown back over the bomb craters. Vietnamese families have moved back into the valley, farm the rich soil, know little of the battles fought there except through government commemorations that celebrate Vietnamese victory and American defeat. Some veterans have returned, have made pilgrimages to the places where they fought, seeking closure or understanding, or simply to prove to themselves that they survived. These return trips are often cathartic, allowing veterans to see the battlefield without the terror, to walk the ground where friends fell, to integrate their memories with present reality. Bobby Harkins made such a trip in 2005, traveling to Vietnam with a group of Bravo Company veterans. They hired a guide who took them up Hill 937, now called Dong Ap Bia by the Vietnamese, its original name. The climb, which had taken 10 days of combat in 1969, took them 4 hours of hiking in 2005. At the summit, they held a small ceremony, read the names of the dead, placed a memorial plaque, and tried to articulate what the battle had meant. Bobby, asked to speak, found himself struggling for words. What could he say that would encompass the complexity of his feelings? That he was proud of what they had done, but wished it hadn't been necessary. That he understood the strategic futility, but valued the personal courage. That he had been shaped by 10 days in 1969 more than by all the other days of his life combined. In the end, he simply said, "We did what we were asked to do. We fought for each other when no one else seemed to be fighting for us, and we survived. That has to be enough." The other veterans nodded, understanding the inadequacy of words, the impossibility of fully expressing what combat does to the human soul. They descended the hill together, these old men who had been young warriors, and flew back to America carrying memories that time had softened but never erased. The lessons of Hamburger Hill and the broader A Shau Valley campaign remain relevant to military planners studying counterinsurgency and conventional warfare in difficult terrain. The battle demonstrated both the extraordinary capabilities and the significant limitations of American military power. American forces, when fully committed with adequate support, could prevail in almost any tactical situation, could defeat enemy forces that were well prepared and highly motivated. But tactical victories didn't translate into strategic success when the war's objectives were unclear, when the enemy could simply withdraw and return, when the cost in casualties exceeded what the American public was willing to accept. Modern military doctrine has incorporated these lessons, emphasizing the importance of clearly defined objectives, the need for sustainable casualty rates, the value of winning local support rather than just destroying enemy forces. The concept of clear, hold, build that dominated counterinsurgency thinking in Iraq and Afghanistan drew directly on Vietnam lessons, though whether those lessons were properly applied remains controversial. What's undeniable is that the men who fought at Hamburger Hill demonstrated qualities that every military seeks to cultivate: courage under fire, unit cohesion, tactical proficiency, and the ability to continue fighting under conditions that would break most people. These qualities didn't win the Vietnam War, but they weren't the reason the war was lost. The fault lay in strategy and policy, in objectives that were unrealistic and means that were inadequate. The soldiers did their part. History should remember that, should honor their service even while questioning the wisdom of those who sent them into battle. Standing here now, decades after the last shots were fired in A Shau Valley, we can see the Battle of Hamburger Hill with a clarity impossible in 1969. We can acknowledge that it was simultaneously a testament to American military prowess and a cautionary tale about the limits of military power. We can honor the courage of the men who fought there while questioning the decisions that led to the battle. We can recognize that the NVA soldiers who defended Hill 937 fought with equal bravery for what they believed, that war creates heroes and tragedies on all sides, that the complexity of human conflict resists simple narratives of good and evil. The young men of the 101st Airborne who climbed Hill 937 in May 1969 have mostly passed into their 70s and 80s now. Some have died, their passing noted in obituaries that mention Vietnam service, but rarely capture the full measure of what they experienced. Others live quietly, carry their memories privately, visit memorials on Veterans Day, and try to explain to grandchildren what it was like to be young and scared and determined in a jungle half a world away. They deserve to be remembered not as victims or as instruments of failed policy, but as men who served honorably in circumstances beyond their control, who did what their country asked, even when that country seemed uncertain about what it was asking. Hamburger Hill stands as their memorial, a name that captures both the horror and the heroism, a place where the American soldiers' capacity for endurance was tested to its absolute limit and was found sufficient. The Viet Cong and NVA learned that day that taunting the 101st Airborne, that trying to turn A Shau Valley into a killing ground for American forces would cost them dearly. They held the valley, but they couldn't hold that hill, not when the Screaming Eagles decided it would be taken. The price was terrible, the aftermath was bitter, but the men who paid it deserve to be remembered with respect and gratitude. If you, like me, believe that the stories of Vietnam deserve to be told with honesty and depth, this channel is where we do exactly that. We don't glorify war or ignore its costs. We don't engage in political debates about who was right or wrong. We simply tell the stories of the men who fought from all sides, with the respect they deserve and the context they require. Finding content that treats Vietnam veterans with the dignity they earned while acknowledging the war's complexity is difficult. That's why this channel exists. Every week I bring you stories researched from official records, veteran interviews, and declassified documents. Stories that help us understand not just what happened, but why it mattered. If you want to continue exploring these forgotten battles, these unsung heroes, these lessons that remain relevant today, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Together, we can ensure that the sacrifices made in places like A Shau Valley are never forgotten, that the lessons learned there are never lost, and that the men who served there know their story has been told honestly and completely. Thank you for being here, for caring about history, for honoring those who lived it.